Dear audience, welcome to the show POWERchat. In today's episode, we'll be discussing about the labor migration situation in Nepal. Joining us today is Mr. Paul Norton, Chief of Mission at International Organization for Migration, IOM, in Nepal. Please allow me to welcome him. Welcome to the show, Mr. Norton.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here.
How have you been?
Very well, thank you. Very busy.
Oh,
Yeah.
you have been here for about 4 years. And
That's correct.
you are working at IOM as the Chief of Mission for
That's
last
correct.
2 years.
That's correct.
How do
That's
you
correct.
analyze the diversity and development process of Nepal?
Well, the diversity is extraordinary, and the development is also extraordinary in certain ways. I've been doing this work for quite a long time, and I've been in many countries, and it's been my great pleasure to work in Nepal. I started out in Damak for 2 years working with the refugees, and I moved to Kathmandu. And one of the things that I see, I think you can look at the statistics, let's say the UN Human Development Index, and Nepal is in the bottom third of developed countries, and that could seem discouraging to some, but in fact, you know, everybody has to start from somewhere, and it's not where you start from, it's where you arrive at. And it's true that there is a lot of inequality and poverty in the country, and there are many reasons for that, not necessarily self-inflicted, but there are problems with the infrastructure, with the economy, with the natural disasters, with the level of employment or its lack of availability. So all of these are factors that affect the prosperity and the development of the country. But there are all ways and tools to address those in an organized fashion. There's a lot of experience in the world, and I think that's what the UN and the international community bring to Nepal to support its own aspirations to become much more prosperous and much more healthy and safe.
Mr. Norton, this is a really interesting observation about the development process of Nepal. Could you tell us about your areas of work and how do you assist the stakeholders working in the areas of migration that IOM has been specialized in the areas?
Right. We came here in 2007 under an agreement with the government, and our first role was really, our task was really to focus on the refugee resettlement, the Bhutanese program. And to date we've resettled almost 113,000 people to 8 countries. It's been very successful. I would say one of the more successful refugee programs that I've been involved in my career. And that's really a tribute to not just the partners, but basically to Nepal for the generosity of accepting these folks for so long and hosting them, but also facilitating the whole operation of the international community trying to find more permanent solutions for these people. Now, during that time, of course, we didn't limit ourselves. IOM is a international institution. We have a lot of experience in migration management in general, and IOM looks at migration as being of benefit to all, to migrants, to society, if it's managed properly. And so we began discussions with the government very early on, and one of the first things that we did with the government was to pioneer the establishment of migrant resource centers. These were established basically to give migrants in different places in the country, not just the capital, but information to access to information, access to comparing jobs and resources, financial literacy issues, remittance issues, health issues, all of these that can help them make an informed decision rather than just going on single sources or being open to exploitation. People without information are vulnerable. So that was the concept, and we pioneered that with the government. We opened with 1 and then 2 and then 3, and then others have taken up that baton, so to speak. And now there are 45 in the country.
You mean the resource centers?
The resource centers that are operated by partly the government and partly government partners in the international community or the local CSO NGO community. So it's very much a collaborative effort, and it's still being developed. We've just proposed, and we're working with the Ministry of Labor and the FEPB and DOFE to standardize some of the information and make sure that it is based on facts and information that's already available to the government and that can be provided in a systematized way to the people who aspire to become labor migrants. Because ultimately we want to ensure that people have a choice as far as possible, and one of the first steps is providing them with information. But we've also conducted quite a lot of research about labor migration, about remittance usage, about seasonal migration, about migration and health. And all of these have led to other areas of development that we are working on right now very proactively with the government.
Well, at a time when the information is not readily and easily available at the public domain, you have started with the resource centers. Could you tell us a little bit more on how migrant workers can benefit from these resource centers?
Well, they're supposed to be one-stop shops. So you have the recruitment agencies, you've got other sources of information, people with mobile phones or the internet, there's ways to investigate. But not everybody has this information. Not all of it is accurate or up to date. And that's the role the government can fulfill and should be fulfilling. And so this complements other efforts that the government has instituted in terms of employment and labor centers and information centers. And so it's the same concept, it's just geared towards people who aspire to go abroad and to give them the information to make a decision.
Well, you are working with many stakeholders and on many issues, including refugee and labor forces.
Correct.
What are the key challenges that you observe in the context of labor migration here in Nepal? And how do you prepare working with the stakeholders addressing them?
That is such a big question, the key challenges. Migration is so multifaceted because it really affects all of society in one way or another. And so there are many different agencies in the government that are involved in migration. There are many CSOs and NGOs. There are many international actors. And you know, the key challenges are the socio-economic development at home, so that people have a choice to move rather than being compelled to move out of necessity. It's also an issue of trying to protect people from exploitation. We see that people with a lack of information, we see people left behind by labor migrants. We've got so many people abroad, mostly the men in the family, and the families that are left behind are a little bit more exposed because they don't have the familial structure that can protect them as a unit. So it's about human rights, it's about dignity, it's about protecting people here and abroad. It's also about what happens to people when they return. Very often when people go abroad, they become acculturated in a different way and they have a different experience. It becomes difficult to move home because they have experience that is difficult to reinsert into the old home routines. It's called reverse culture shock in a way. And so all of these are issues. The remittance issue, how can that be channeled so that it can be contributing to the economic development? How can people be facilitated in developing businesses, becoming entrepreneurs? So there are so many challenges, and part of this is linked to the challenge of data. of information, basic information, which is not readily available. Different agencies have data, but a lot of it is just not captured because the structures aren't there, the questions aren't there. So it becomes difficult to research and analyze and base your policies and your procedures on concrete evidence-based information. And so it's a real challenge, I think, in Nepal that we're working with the government, and so are many other parties, to try and support and arrive at solutions so that there's information that can be used to inform policy and improve the practices, the procedures, the structures that will support migrants, protect their safety, protect their dignity.
Well, Mr. Norton, you said about the exploitation that labor migrants have been facing abroad, and there are many stories in the media that they have been exploited, some have been sometimes killed, and there are some efforts from the government level as well.
Right.
Is there any existing mechanism that could rescue the migrants or migrants workers who are exploited, or as the UN specialized agency in migration,
Right.
how can you IOM support the government and other stakeholders working modality on addressing the exploitation issue so that they live a dignified life?
Right. IOM has a lot of experience in this field. We've been operating what are called assisted voluntary return reintegration programs for 25 or 30 years internationally. And we've done some of that here. We had a very good project funded by the Qatar Development Fund for the last few years. And we assisted almost 400 stranded migrants, trafficked human beings, people who fell into distress through illness or other difficulties. Then we were able to assist those. This was done very much in close coordination with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the consular services abroad, as well as NGOs here at home. So there are programs that can do that, but ultimately it's the government's responsibility. And so the models are there, the experience is there, and that can be shared and provided, and we've done a significant amount of that in the last few years through this project. But how can it be continued? Because where's the funding come from? And that's a difficult issue to address. So there's another side of it, though, which goes back to the migrant resource centers. If people have pre-departure orientation, if they have skills matching, if they have an idea of what jobs are they going to go, if they have standard terms of employment, if they have ethical recruitment systems, all of these have been developed internationally. All of these are being applied in different countries. And this is something that we're working with the government here to also try and begin instituting those in some kind of regular fashion. But it takes time because these are policy issues, these are regulatory issues, and they're enforcement issues. So there are models out there, there's practices that can be applied, there is experience. It's just a matter of bringing those and tailoring those to the needs, specific needs of Nepal and its population, and the population that remains at home and goes abroad.
Well, do you have any guideline or approach at the global level on the global governance of migration? Yes,
and I welcome that question because it's a very exciting time in the migration world. IOM and certain governments and other partners have been working for around 20 years because we recognized that you have the Refugee Convention and the Convention for Children, and you have the Convention for Human Rights and for Labor, and there are a lot of conventions that protect certain aspects of migration. But there is no standard, there is no applied, agreed, respected standard for all migrants, because it's not just about labor migrants. It's also, you've got many forms of migration. You have displaced people, and you have trafficked human beings. You have tourism. You have travel for education and religion. And now we're seeing that there's going to be some measure of migration because of climate change or natural disaster, all of these things. And there is no standard to cover that bigger picture of migration. So in 2016, after much discussion amongst the General Assembly, the member states of the UN, it was agreed that they prepared a New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants, and as part of that declaration they recognized the importance of migration to all countries, and that there was a need for some kind of standard that they could all agree on, or at least aspire to. And they decided that they instructed themselves, with the help of the UN, to develop a global compact on migration for safe, regular, and humane migration. So that's in process since 2016. Nepal was one of the leaders on that in certain ways. It was amongst a group of countries that held national consultations with stakeholders, governmental, non-governmental, the media, academia, anybody, CSOs, anybody who's involved in migration in any form in Nepal was participating in those consultations. And they came out with a national position paper that informed their position on the Global Compact on Migration. Similarly, as the chair of the Colombo process of sending countries, it's 12 states, and those 12 states in Asia represent, depending on the figures you can find, 40 to 50% of all labor migrants from the sending countries, which is enormous. It's an enormous number of people. And so these 12 states, Nepal convened a meeting with them under its chairmanship role with the Colombo process, and it was supported by IOM and the Swiss government and some other parties, and they came up with their own, those 12 states under the leadership of Nepal came up with their own position paper. And I'm very pleased to say that all of those recommendations made it into the first draft of the Global Compact on Migration. Now that's being negotiated right now in New York, and it will come up for a vote by the General Assembly for adoption in the autumn of this year.
Mr. Norton, it's
yes.
only 2 years that this approach has been agreed by the nation states.
Right.
How can countries like Nepal, a major labor sending country, benefit from this approach?
Well, it's already benefited because it has raised its stature as a leader in the discussion on labor migration. And it is because of the remittances to GDP is 30%. The number of migrants that go abroad is quite large when we look at it per capita. And so Nepal has a real voice in this discussion, and it has been performing at a very high level and is taken very seriously because of its chairmanship of the Colombo process, but also because of its nexus as a labor sending country that faces all different forms of migration and not just labor migration. So it really has informed that discussion. It is very much involved in those regular negotiations that are ongoing now in New York, and Nepal can be proud of its representation on labor migration.
What is the IOM's role in GCM process, presenting the position paper at the negotiation process?
Right. Well, the GCM is a member state-led approach that's being negotiated by the member states. IOM's role is to provide technical and policy advice, essentially. We are assisting the Secretariat in preparing these negotiations, but we are asked to provide policy guidance, provide technical advice, and IOM is the UN Migration Agency. We have a lot of experience doing that, almost 70 years of working on these issues. And so that is our role, is to provide that support to the member states, to the international community, the General Assembly.
Well, Mr. Norton, could you also tell us the outstanding progresses that have taken place here in Nepal addressing the labor migration issues since the establishment of IOM here in Nepal?
Well, labor migration in general, is a very big issue, and I think that with the adoption of the Constitution, with the elections last year, with the new government that's been formed, really now is the time. A lot of preparatory work has been done in terms of research, in terms of pioneering these migrant resource centers. But there are some key areas that we really feel that we contribute to, and I need to remind myself because I'm getting old now. So we've done a lot of research, particularly on labor migration, both departing and returning labor migrants, and we've coupled that with remittances research. We've recently concluded a very comprehensive project on that, and the report is just in publication right now, but we did consult with the government and again with the multi-stakeholder parties involved in migration, non-governmental as well as governmental, and that helped us to inform the recommendations that come out of this report. So that will be released very soon. We supported Nepal as a member of the SARC in coming out with a declaration, the Kathmandu Declaration on labor migration in 2014. And I was just over at the SARC the other day this week and talking about how we move that forward at the technical level. The SARC is a body that can be and should be used to advance these discussions as well. There's a lot of movement, migration within the region, as well as sending countries and also as receiving countries. So the SARC has a vested interest in this as well, and we believe it's a good platform for having this discussion. And Nepal has been a leader on that, and IOM has certainly supported Nepal in that. And one other area that is a bit neglected in consideration of migration is migration and health. It's both for people who leave, go abroad, and come back. We're talking about individual health of the migrants themselves, but we're also talking about public health. People are subject to or exposed to new maladies when they're abroad, and they may bring them back. And so there are public health issues. So we've been working for the last year with the Ministry of Health and other agencies on developing a migration and health policy, which is now in the endorsement phase.
Well, Mr. Norton, there are very interesting issues coming out, but we are coming to the end of the show. I would like to ask you about the IOM's vision on developing solution towards the labor migration work here in Nepal. Very quickly.
Very quickly, ultimately, we want to make sure that people are safe, they have their dignity, and that they have enough information to make a choice rather than have to move out of necessity. And that involves development in Nepal. It involves the recognizing and respecting the aspirations of people to empower themselves and better themselves, maybe gain experience and remittance money abroad, and we want to help them to employ that to the best effect. Ultimately, we see migration benefits society and the migrants themselves, and we want to help Nepal to do that. We want to see a prosperous and a healthy Nepal, and we think that that is within reach. And I thank you for this opportunity to speak about this.
Well, Mr. Norton, thank you very much for your time. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Okay, likewise. Thank you very much.
Dear audience, time now to wrap up the show. Keep watching us. See you next week. Namaste.